for questions until the very end. Okay. And speaking of our speaker this evening is Edith Bayer, who is the Energy Policy Team Lead with the Oregon Department of Energy. Prior to that, she was with the International Energy Agency, where she was an energy policy analyst, and in that role led our cooperation with Latin American governments like Mexico, Chile, and other governments to figure out approaches on how to increase energy efficiency. Edith and I had a little bit of back and forth email getting her ready for this, and I wanted to share a little bit what she said about herself. She wrote to me and said, "It took me a while to land my career. I majored in Russian and Spanish and then taught English in the Peace Corps in Siberia and then for 2 years in Japan. I also spent the first year of my career after law school working in Russia." And so, and so I hope that Edith will tell us a little bit more about those things, but please join me in welcoming Edith Bayer.
Okay, I'm going to see. Oh, it's working. Okay. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for the introduction, and I really appreciate the invitation from the Olympia World Affairs Council to speak today. I came up today by train from Eugene, Oregon, where I'm based, and the train was pretty much on time. So I'm relatively new, actually, to the Pacific Northwest. I spent the last 9 years living in Europe. I worked at the International Energy Agency, and before that, I was working for a nonprofit organization called the Regulatory Assistance Project. And part of that time, I was working out of Vermont and then 4 years out of Brussels. So my talk today is based on a combination of the experience that I had working on policy in Europe, as well as living there, and also lots of research to get up to speed on what the latest and greatest data is on the energy transition in Europe. And I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with you all at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to keep my eye on the clock so that I don't ramble on longer than my time allotted. So I'm just going to start with some basics so that we're all on the same page. And I think it's also helpful just to look at Europe and compare it to a few key indicators from the US. So the European Union, I'm talking about the European Union, and there are some countries in Europe that don't belong. So focusing on the European Union, 27 countries compared to 50 US states. The population is 449 million people compared to 300-something million in the US. It's covered up. The area is 4 million square, my joke is hidden, but it's 4 million square kilometers, and then I have miles for the US. It was my first joke. And anyway, it is a smaller area, actually. It's about, oh, thank you. It's about 1.6 million square miles. So the area is smaller, but population is bigger. And the European Union was founded in the 1992 Maastricht Treaty, and not all countries joined at once. There were some countries that joined later, but that was kind of the start of the European Union as we know it today. So that's just some, oops, let's see. So I'm going to start off with some just broad brush view of what's happening in Europe on the energy front. So this looks at greenhouse gas emissions in the EU 27 between 1990 and 2021. Often you see graphs that start with 1990 because that's when the Kyoto Protocol was signed and is when a lot of countries started their to set carbon goals, and those have been often updated over time. And so you can see that the energy sector accounts for almost 77% of greenhouse gas emissions. Then you can see the other sectors responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. And you can also see that there's been a significant reduction in those emissions since 1990. And then on the right, you can see all of the sectors responsible for that energy consumption and for those emissions. So you see that the energy industry, which is mostly electricity, is pretty big. Transportation is really big. Manufacturing, construction, and residential is energy use in homes. So that's our starting point. So looks pretty good. A lot of emissions reductions since 1990. So now let's look at progress towards Europe's energy targets. So the European Union has set the goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. That doesn't mean zero emissions. There are some approaches to also capture carbon and to increase land sinks, but largely we're talking about reductions. And here you can see the overall carbon neutrality target. It's that kind of light blue line that extends out to 2050. And you can see how Europe is doing in terms of the renewable energy share that it's set as a goal. So they have a goal to achieve a certain level of renewable energy in their mix, not just electricity, out to 2050. And that's kind of here, I've heard this is a pretty awesome, there we go. That's this line. This is final energy consumption, which is expected to drop, and there's a lot of work on to improve energy efficiency, to reduce energy consumption. And then this line is the greenhouse gas target that goes all the way down to 2050. And so you can see that the lines are kind of trending in sort of the right direction, but there's a lot of work yet to be done. And this is European level, and what I'm going to want to do in this presentation is dive into a few countries and give a few examples of how it's going in different countries in Europe. So next slide. So Europe has a legislative framework driving a lot of these changes that you see in those graphs. So in Europe, there are two main types of legislation. There are directives and there are regulations. Regulations apply directly to countries. They just immediately apply, and directives have to be transposed, meaning that the member country takes that goal, often it's a goal, and then decides how it's going to meet it. And there's some direction on how to do it, but there's also quite a bit of leeway in how to decide to do it. So you end up with a really diverse landscape across Europe in terms of what mechanisms they're using to incentivize things. Whether it's, for example, here we have a lot of utility-funded energy efficiency programs. In Europe, there are some countries that choose to go the utility route, but others who decide to just really lean on carbon taxation. So there's a pretty broad range of ways to get there. But I've tried to list here on the left the main mechanisms that Europe has put in place at EU level. So there's climate goals. So I mentioned the 2050 carbon neutrality goal, but there are also targets for renewable energy, for energy efficiency in the electricity sector. There's a cap and trade system. So there's a cap on carbon that reduces over time. And then there's the opportunity for anybody covered by that cap. If it's more expensive for them to reduce their emissions and it's cheaper for somebody else, they can buy those cheaper reductions from somebody else. So there's a bit of an economic mechanism there to help find the cheapest reductions. There is an energy efficiency directive. There's an energy performance of buildings directive. There's a directive called eco-design, which focuses on appliance efficiency. And anybody who's in the energy world will hear policies that are very similar to policies that we have in the US. There are goals around transportation, both efficiency, but also moving towards zero emission vehicles. There are renewable energy targets. There's a lot of work around electricity markets. Once you move to having a lot of variable renewable energy on the system, like wind and solar, it's really beneficial to have a bigger interconnected grid because the sun might be blowing here and not there. The wind may be blowing here, not there. The sun might be shining in different places. So you want a system that's bigger than the weather and where it's easy for those electrons to move around. So a lot of work on electricity markets, and then there's a gas package as well. And there's a lot of work that both focuses on security of supply, which I'll talk a little bit about, but also about how to transition away from fossil and towards clean fuels. I'm not going to make this a policy-based discussion, don't worry. Okay, so now I want to dive right into a few countries and talk about a little bit of the things that are happening there. And I'm not gonna do a nuts to bolts overview. I'll try to focus on some of the framework of why countries are where they are, why things are different, and talk a little bit about some of the interesting kind of insights and facts that come out of this. So some of you all might know more than I do about some of these countries. I'll focus on certain elements. So I'll be looking at here. I'll use my little pointer here. We'll be looking at France, Germany, Poland, and the Netherlands, and that's also France down there. Okay, so I'm going to start with Germany. Why Germany? Besides just being really interesting, Germany is Europe's biggest economy. It accounts for 20% of electricity generation in Europe. It was also one of the earliest countries to undertake a clean energy transition at the same time that they decided to phase out nuclear energy. And they put a lot of support into renewable energy. And so a lot of eyes have been on Germany for a long time. The origins of the German energy transition really starts with nuclear power. The anti-nuclear movement that began in the early 1970s gave rise to the German Green Party at the end of the 70s, 1979, 1980. And Germany has a very carbon-intensive electricity system in particular because it has a lot of coal and lignite. Lignite is also a kind of coal, but it's like a brown, wet, heavy coal that is harder to transport. So generally you dig it up and you burn it nearby. And so that put a lot of pressure on development of renewable power when they said, well, we want to phase out nuclear and decarbonize. Germany was one of the first countries in the world to introduce a feed-in tariff for renewable power. So essentially paying people kind of an above market price for a fixed period of time for generating renewable power. And it has a lot of other policies that it's put in place focusing on buildings, on industry, on transportation. So I'm going to start here in 1965, just to give us a little bit of perspective and distance from where Germany is today. And you can see in 1965, essentially the system was entirely coal-fired, so there weren't even nuclear power plants yet. And so I would say that the title of my presentation is Energy Revolution, in a way because it's catchy, and in a way because actually there are a lot of things happening that are pretty revolutionary. But you can see here, the pink is nuclear, and so nuclear power plants started to be built kind of in the late 70s and into the 80s. And so that was really one of the first big changes on the German power system. And then you can also see that gas started to take off and play a really, really big role as well. I took out oil. So this graph originally had oil and had all energy use. Oil is also huge because the transportation sector is responsible for so much energy consumption and emissions. But I'm mostly focusing more on what I know, which is electricity, and I know less about transportation. So I thought I'd talk more about the things that I'm familiar with. Let's see. I think that's all I wanted to say about this slide, but this is just kind of that historical view of starting point and why Germany has so much coal. Well, it's because it's a resource that they have on their system. So this graph starts with 1990, when nuclear power accounted for about 25% of generation on the nuclear power system. And then hard coal and lignite, which is, I can use the pointer again. So nuclear is the purple up here, and then this is all coal and lignite. And then you have natural gas in gray. And so in 1990, those were really the dominant resources on the power system. But then if you look at renewables, there's a pretty unbelievably huge shift towards renewables at the same time that nuclear power completely has gone away now. Very recently, actually. I think, let's see. I don't think I have the year. No, 2023. So Germany closed its last nuclear plant last year. And in 2023, wind and coal, was the first year that wind and coal both accounted for the same share of generation, 27%. So it's pretty impressive. So this is just the breakdown in 2023, so you can see it a little more simply. So this is just 1 year. This is a graph from the International Energy Agency, and you can see coal is still pretty big, but so is wind. Nuclear is, there's still a little bit of nuclear. This is before it was shut down. There's a bit of hydro, bit of biofuels and waste, and solar PV also plays a pretty significant role. And it's important to say that this is electricity generation, so this isn't counting how much capacity is installed on the system. This is how much was actually produced by these different resources. And so the main points I want to make about Germany is really that Germany's starting point was really coal-based. And then it invested in nuclear as a way to diversify its resources, to grow its electricity generation system. Now it's gone really strongly in the direction of renewables and continues to do so. But one of the things that's really interesting is, and I apologize, this is all in German, which I don't speak, but a German friend helped me find this graphic. And I have translated here with the help of Google Translate what the shares mean. And what I want to point out here is that individuals are actually responsible for 30% of the renewables that are online in Germany today, and farmers for 10%. And this is because of very strong policies supporting distributed renewables, a feed-in tariff, and it's not just solar. It's largely solar. It's solar, it's wind, it's bioenergy, which I think probably falls more in farmers. But there's a really diversified ownership here. And if you look at the electricity suppliers, they only own under 20%, which is pretty interesting and pretty different, I think, from what we see in a lot of other places. And there's some criticism that that's been very expensive. It has been very expensive. It's also really interesting to see how many people kind of own a share of the energy transition in Germany. And I think this is the last one. So the latest thing apparently in Germany are solar balconies, and they're popping up everywhere. They're actually causing a bit of a problem on the power system because they need to be able to be curtailed because they can feed a lot of energy at once into the power system, and that can create a problem. So it's not all easy, but I just loved that this is the latest and greatest of, they're not very expensive, they're a lot more affordable than putting rooftop solar. They don't generate quite as much power because if you're on the roof, you get a lot more sun during the day, but kind of cool. Okay, so I'm going to move now to France. I saw this stuff happening. So you've all heard of the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest movement in France. I'm not going to focus on the yellow vest movement too much, but I thought it was an interesting contrast to the slide before, where you have a really large share of ownership in the energy transition in Germany, and to France, where the starting point is really different, and I'll get to that in a second. But there have been some really serious speed bumps. And one of them were these protests that came out of, they didn't just come out of a fuel tax, but they came out of a tax on fuels that people living in the countryside felt were really unfair and were coming from the urban elites who were leaving rural folks behind, which I'm sure doesn't sound familiar to anybody. But they were really serious protests, and they clawed back essentially the policy because it had so much, it raised so much anger and so many feelings. So let's talk a little bit about France. So France has a very different starting point. This is France in 1972, again, going back in time. And this is electricity generation. So again, I'm not looking at the whole energy sector, just electricity generation. And sorry, I just realized that for people on that side of the room, I'm not pointing at your graph. Is that okay? All right. And so on the bottom here, we have coal. France does have some coal resources, and there's also coal imports that happen. So this isn't always domestic, but some coal generation, a lot of oil. Oil is a very expensive way to generate power. And in the 1970s, it was a very problematic way to generate power because of the oil crises in the Middle East and what that did to costs. And so that freaked France out quite a bit. There was also some hydro, and you can see hydro is pretty steady over that time. So France has a share of hydropower that it uses for power generation, but the yellow is nuclear. So France took a strategic decision to get off of its oil dependence, and they invested in nuclear very heavily. And so, and this goes just to 2012, but the point is to show that growth of nuclear power in France. So this just shows kind of how this is nuclear construction over that time. So it's a really steep curve. So you have a little bit of nuclear power plants around 1976, and then just these very steep steps up to 2018. I think the most recent nuclear power plant was built in 1999, I believe, was the last one that went online. There's another one that I'll talk about in a minute. It's not quite online yet. So what's happening on the energy transition front in France? So France is pretty interesting in that, in a way, they haven't quite made up their minds. So you can see here, this is 1995 to 2024. These are all from different sources. So this is from the National Transmission Authority. So the years are all a bit different and the graphics look a bit different. But you can see here that you have nuclear, the yellow again, and then you have hydropower. You have fossil-fired thermal, which is coal and gas. And then you have an increase in wind and solar and renewables. So France is diversifying and starting to build out some of those other renewable resources. But these are shifting sands to give you all a break from the really busy slides. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been happening in France while you look at this beautiful picture of sand. So in 2015, the law on energy transition for green growth set really clear targets for the country's energy sector. So there are greenhouse gas emission reduction goals out to 2050, a goal of reducing consumption by half by 2050. So a big reliance on energy efficiency and electrification. And the goal set there was cutting nuclear power production by 50%, and while reducing fossil fuel consumption by 30% by 2030, and then increasing renewables by quite a bit too. However, today, France aims to continues to have climate goals. It has a carbon neutral goal by 2050. It wants to cut emissions by half by 2030, but it plans to increase nuclear production. So they've changed their minds. A lot of the nuclear fleet, it's aging. You saw the decades that it was built in. And so in 2022, France actually became a net importer of electricity, which has been rare for them historically because they lost so much nuclear capacity because many plants were offline for planned maintenance, unplanned maintenance. So there are some bumps in the road around nuclear. But right now they have plans to build 6 new nuclear power plants, and the government has announced that it needs 14. So there are some pretty big numbers out there. I just want to end on how it's going with the reactor, the newest reactor that they've been working on. So this is an article from Le Monde, from a newspaper. And again, apologies, it's all in French, but you can see the point, which is that the project started in 2007. This is the Flamanville 3 reactor. The project has now gone up to 19.1 billion euros, which is a 479% increase in cost. And the time that was expected, the durée here, is 250% longer. And so this reactor is still not online, and this is the kind of thing that makes people nervous about what to rely on and what the costs are really going to be. At the same time, we see variable renewable costs falling quite a bit and being quite cost competitive. And so I'm leaving it with a neutral question of kind of what this could mean for France and its targets and those shifting sands. Oh, okay, and I wanted to show this because I want to tie it back to a big part of the energy transition, of course, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is how France is doing. It goes up and down in part because there are fluctuations in the nuclear power fleet. And when nuclear is less available, then mostly natural gas has been filling in that gap in France. And so you have some ups and downs in their emissions. 2024 is still, I wouldn't take this number as decided yet. That's why there's a little, there's like a little clock there. It's yet, I'm not sure that the emissions will be that low in 2024. But, you know, there's a reduction, but it's a little hard to see how significantly France is reducing its emissions. I will say that it has one of the lowest carbon power sectors in Europe because of its nuclear power fleet, to begin with. Okay, now we're going to move to Poland. I've sprinkled all these languages on the slides, I'm sorry, but I think that these are really powerful. So chcemy oddychać means we want to breathe. This is a Polish ad, a campaign poster. And what it says here is jedno życie, jeden Kraków, jeden podpis, which means one life, one Krakow, one signature. So this is a campaign for anti-smog laws to be passed in Poland. And for those who don't like children, or like children and puppies, this one is in English. It says the same thing. And his name is Flipper, and he comes from Ruczaj, which is really cute. So this is the Krakow smog alarm. The reason that it's a dragon is that Krakow has a castle with a famous dragon called Smok-Wawelski, and he's an icon of the city, and so they took that icon and built it into the campaign. And these are Polish headlines from the 1980s. And you can see here that this guy's wearing a gas mask. Here's a big pollution hand about to kill a flower. And so Poland has had an air quality issue for quite some time. And I want to dig into why so much coal in Poland. So Poland, similar to Germany, has a lot of coal reserves, and so historically has really relied on coal for power production. This is energy consumption, so this also includes oil. That oil is primarily for transportation. But I also wanted to go back pretty far, so only back to the 60s here, but you can see that in 1965, oil consumption was much lower. There were fewer cars on the roads, as in most places. Coal really accounted for most of the energy system. And then you had a little bit of gas, and the gas has grown over time. And then here you can start seeing some renewables popping up. But again, the starting point is sort of the natural resource that was there. So if we fast forward to today, this is now just electricity. So we've any oil here, it's very minimal, and it's oil for electricity production, usually for peaking. So in May 2024, which isn't on here, but you can see that there's a huge increase so the gray is natural gas, the red is biofuels, very little waste, but a little bit. Then you have a little hydro, and you have quite a bit of wind and solar PV that's come on pretty quickly onto the system. So in May 2024, I pulled out this number. Poland reached a record of 36% of electricity generated from renewable power, which is pretty huge considering where it started. And when I started working in Poland in 2010, coal was accounting for 90 to 95% of electricity production, and it was very hard to talk about alternative resources. About half of the renewable energy is wind power, the rest is solar and biomass. Poland does not have a long-term kind of comprehensive decarbonization strategy, but it has a relatively new government that has stronger climate ambitions than the previous one, and so we're watching to see how that unfolds. But I'd like to go back to air quality, because it's easy to look at these big graphs and think about like, oh, okay, so you have a little less of this in the power generation stack and invest in renewables. But the things that speak to people on the ground are often not the things that speak to nerds sitting at their desks analyzing energy numbers. And so what's what's really a powerful issue in Poland are these coal stoves. So coal stoves used for heating. In 2022, about 1/3 of homes in Poland were heated with coal or wood stoves. And most often the coal is very poor quality and a lot of the stoves are very old. And what that leads to is very high levels of fine particulate matter and benzoate-pyrene, which are both really problematic for public health. So this is a map of the worst coal stoves in Poland. And it also in 2022, from November 2022. So these numbers have gone down a bit, but these aren't even all of them. These are just the ones that are class 3 or worse. And you can see that it adds up to about 1 million of these coal stoves around the country. And if you want to understand what class 3 or worse is, this is class 3, 150 micrograms per cubic meter, essentially pretty polluting. But then you have subclass stoves, which are multiples worse. And there are a lot of those. And I'll just add that a lot of the anecdotal evidence is not just that it's coal being burned, it's also plastic bottles and trash. And so that creates even worse air pollution problems. But it's also an affordability problem because a lot of people have these stoves that really low-grade coal is cheap. And so transitioning away, it's not enough just to have a law that says you can't have the stove because people will say, well, I can't afford to pay for natural gas or electricity. And probably my house is leaky too. So I want to give a positive message here, actually. So that campaign that I mentioned earlier really spearheaded a national campaign in Poland to address air quality, and they're actually addressing climate through air quality, but the driver is poor air quality. And so Poland is divided up into voivodeships, so they're essentially states. And so all but 2 states have passed an anti-smog law of some sort. Since this campaign started. And this is really pretty recent. This was a major uphill battle. Let's see. Oh, yeah. I just had to throw this in because I met Lech Wałęsa. It was pretty cool. It has nothing to do with air quality. I was like, I have to dig up that picture of Lech Wałęsa because it makes me look like I'm somebody. Anyway, this was a coworker of mine at the Regulatory Systems Project. But we went to a conference in Gdańsk, and it was energy related. And he was a speaker, and I got to meet him, which was pretty impressive because this is somebody who you know, really historical figure. So I'm going to see what the next slide is because I haven't given you all the information. No, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back here for a second. Because I had a few more things I wanted to say about this clean heat program. So, because I think that a lot of the same measures that apply to address this air pollution are the same measures that we apply for climate change. And I think it's a useful way of thinking about how we motivate people to change. And it's not always the same motivator. In this case, it was really, I know the guy. It's a guy who was an energy analyst, has 2 daughters, lived in Krakow, and said, I'm going to start a campaign to clean up the air, or I have to leave my city. I can't live here because I know what this is doing to my kids' health. And he just did it. And it's amazing. But essentially, there's funding from the national government. There's a big program called Clean Heat that's administered by a national agency called the National Fund for Environmental Protection and Water Management. And essentially, they collect fines from environmental infractions and then apply those fines to things like stove replacement. More than 800,000 households have benefited from support from that program. There also, as I mentioned, there are those anti-smog laws that have been passed, and there's been a lot of work to also renovate homes, because unless you renovate the home, often it's really expensive to heat if you're not using the coal stove, and so to keep that cost manageable, there are a lot of weatherization programs in place. Okay, so I'm going to skip over Lech again and shift to the Netherlands. This is the last country. I'm checking the time. I think we're okay. Netherlands, That just gets your brains very different place, very different starting point. So this is the Groningen gas field, this green mitt. And so in 1959, the Netherlands discovered that it was sitting on a lot of gas, a lot of natural gas. And that has shaped its energy sector ever since. So you can see here, this one I went all the way back to, I wish I had one that goes back to 1800 for all the countries, but I didn't. This comes from the Dutch Statistical Agency. So essentially you can see coal coming online and kind of, start of the Industrial Revolution, a little bit of oil, and then you see kind of oil and gas just explode at the same time. Oil, again, primarily for transportation, but natural gas largely for electricity production. And it just overnight became, just under people's feet, and they just started to extract it and export it, and it became the main source supplying power. And then you have non-fossil energy here that started to take some of the place of that natural gas. So in 2023, so that chart, I just want to go back for a second because it seems a little, so that chart doesn't go quite as far into the future as this. So this is 2023. Again, this is data from the IEA, and natural gas accounted for 37.9% of electricity generation, but wind and solar have really taken off. So the Netherlands has made a huge shift towards renewables as well. Similar in scale, I would say, to what we saw for Germany. And that's really significant. But again, motivations are not, it's not always the same motivator for what drives climate action. And in this case, sorry, I've lost my notes here. I want to make sure that I get the date right. Well, yeah, 2012. In 2012, natural gas extraction was identified as the cause of earthquakes in the north of the country. And it's caused more than 1,000 earthquakes, leading to substantial damage to buildings. And in a lot of cases, these buildings just have to be torn down, and people are essentially fighting for compensation in many cases. And that takes a long time. So this built public support to cut back on natural gas drilling. And so there's been quite a big cut in drilling for natural gas in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands has set a target of phasing out all gas heating in homes by 2050. So because gas was so cheap and so available, most homes are heated with natural gas. And now they plan to phase that out entirely by 2050. But that was a very fast about face, and how to do that is what I want to talk about. So this is household heating in the Netherlands. Sorry, I've shifted the axis here. So that's 27, here's 2022. These are individual gas boilers in homes. And then you have heat pumps. Some of these are not all electric heat pumps, but many of them are, a large share of them are. Here you have district heating without gas consumption. And then here you have kind of unknown. So you can see that the shift is not that fast. It's not happening very quickly, this shift away from gas heaters. But if you look at it another way, these are sales of heat pumps in the Netherlands from 2013 to 2023, and you can see huge growth. And actually, you see this around Europe, and particularly from when Russia invaded Ukraine and Europe got very scared about gas, which I'll talk about in a moment. Heat pump sales have really skyrocketed, and so there is movement, but you don't yet see it on that mega scale. I think it's really interesting to just look at how the Netherlands is undertaking its transition from gas. So essentially, there's a national law about how to do it, but then municipalities have been charged with drawing up plans on how to do it, but they're supposed to do it neighborhood by neighborhood. So it's a very interesting approach. And these are all the actors who are involved within the neighborhood. So you have the gas and electricity grid operators, heating grid operators, because there's quite a bit of district heating. You have homeowners, renters, local entrepreneurs, housing associations, owner associations, other landlords. So it's not that dissimilar to what you would expect in the US, but this is who's driving the train on how to do this thing, how to get off of gas. I'll just say this comes from a paper by the group. You can't see it here, but they're called CE Delft, and they're a Dutch-based consultancy. But the one thing that's missing here is sort of the amount of influence that everybody has. And so I just want to say that the national government has actually had a lot of influence on things like building standards, because it's not just about getting off gas, it's also about energy efficiency in buildings. And this becomes really interesting when you look at it, because so Europe has labels for buildings, A to G. It's pretty standardized, although each country has different climate, so it gets nerdy quickly. A is the best, the most energy efficient home. G is the worst. And you can see that while maybe renovations have been a bit slow, some of these lower efficiency homes have not been doing as well. There's been a huge increase in A-labeled homes in the country. And so just a huge increase in how much of the building stock is energy efficient. And that has had a much bigger impact than the shift of from gas to non-fossil heating sources. So you saw there that it's kind of, that earlier graph almost looked like gas heating was stuck in terms of technology. There isn't that much change. Heat pumps are rising, but you don't see it yet in those graphs. But here you can see a really big reduction in energy consumption. And that's largely because of energy efficiency measures in homes. And I will also say that these 2 years, it's probably a combination of warmer winters do play a role, and have played a role over the past 2 years, and also a lot of conservation measures because of the fear over gas supply in Europe. So speaking of gas, I feel like I need to touch on this because it's not yet there's been a huge transition in how Europe sources its gas. And essentially, Russia's invasion of Ukraine put Europe on wartime footing in terms of energy security. And I think that there's a really interesting lesson here in how quickly things can change when you're on wartime footing and when there's a crisis. And there could be a whole nother presentation on the oil crisis in the 1970s and how that also stimulated a lot of action in energy. So I just have a few slides on this, but I thought that this was really important to show. So these are the different exports to the EU from Russia. So this is Nord Stream. This is Ukraine Transit, goes through Ukraine, Yamal and Turk Stream. And you can see that from 2021, just over a period of 2 years, most of those gas exports have gone away. And there's obviously a complicated story about that. Russia shut down some pipelines. Some pipelines got blown up underwater. But in the end, there's been a huge reduction. And that's been replaced with gas from other places. So here you have pipelines from Libya, here you have pipelines from Algeria, and you have liquid natural gas. And the latest that I have heard, just talking to experts who I know, is that the LNG ports have gotten a bit overbuilt by this point. But there was very fast action to build these liquid natural gas ports and regasification plants. And that's really, I mean, the speed of change is really striking. I've also heard, this is all anecdotal, that a lot of contracts in Asia were not necessarily fulfilled, and that gas was rerouted to Europe, and Europe was paying a higher price. So lots of interesting stuff behind there. This is just a map to show us so this is gas coming in from Algeria, from Libya, from Norway. So Germany is now getting a lot of its gas from there. You have the Nord Stream pipeline. Then you have all of these here coming from Russia. And then all these little red dots are the LNG ports, the liquid natural gas ports. So, I mean, Europe's transition to being carbon neutral, the shift in gas sourcing doesn't do anything to help Europe transition towards carbon neutrality. But I find it to be a really interesting case on how we can move in the energy sector, but also how much harder it is to move towards something different than it is to find a substitute for something that we already have. And I thought I would end on just going back to Europe and how Europe is doing overall, and whether we think that, well, I'll leave opinions to you all, but just to see how they're doing. So total greenhouse gas emissions reduction in Europe from 1990 to 2022, and this comes from the European Environment Agency, excluding international transport. So there's been 32.4% reduction, which is pretty huge. Natural gas has actually gone up a little bit, but solid fossil fuels are down 21.4%. That's mostly coal and lignite. Oil products are down 7.4%. Industrial processes and product use are down, and there's a bit of a reduction in agricultural emissions. So this is economy-wide. This is not just the energy sector. And this is how we're doing in the US. So these are our energy-related CO2 emissions by sector. This is from the Energy Information Administration. And I just pulled this. This is pretty recent data. And we're struggling to get that trajectory to go more steeply. But as we know, in different parts of the country, the graph looks very different, similar to Europe. So there are some regions and states that are doing much better, and some that are not in terms of emissions reductions. But I didn't want to end by dissing the US, because that's not nice. I have a quote that I want to give about Europe, but I need to find it because I've gone totally off script most of this. Here we go. So this is from the European Environment Agency. This is progress towards achieving climate goals in the EU 27. These are net greenhouse gas emissions. ECL is just the carbon neutral goal now. And we can see that Europe has actually beat its 2020 target. Here's the 2030 target, but here are the projections. These are the projections out to 2050. So Europe is, even though it's made a lot of progress, it's not yet on track when you project out its emissions reductions. So here's the quote. I'm going to diss Europe instead of the US to finish off. Not diss them, but give a bit of a perspective. So the European Environment Agency says, taking into account currently adopted and planned measures, net emissions are projected to reach a level of 62% below 1990 levels in 2040, so that's here, and 66% in 2050, so 66% is not carbon neutral. These projections largely exceed the recommended 90% reduction for 2040 and the legally binding climate neutrality target for 2050, and indicates a need to continue developing ambitious policies to reduce emissions in all sectors in the coming years and decades. So lots of work still to be done, but hopefully those are some insights from how it's going, what the numbers tell us, and a little bit about the dynamics within different countries and what's driving action. So I think it took me 5 minutes longer than the 45 minutes, but it's pretty good.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Edith. Until we have other questions, just a quick question to you. Have you been following COP29?
I've not been following it closely. I've been really busy at work, my day job.
All right.
A little bit, but actually, I wanted to say that I have a lot of insights from work that I did, and it's why I focused on certain things, because they're areas that I focused on. But I suspect that in this room there are a lot of people who have a lot of expertise and knowledge, and so I don't want to just answer questions. I'd love to hear from others if people want to share perspectives. Just wanted to throw that out there. Yeah.
Any comments, questions?
Hi, Edith. My name is Nathan. I go to Evergreen. I go to the Evergreen State College, and I am studying political economy right now. And our focus this week has been sort of the the economy and the environment, its effect on the environment. And one question I was thinking of, just like on my way here, that I still would love to hear like your take on, like in the U.S. and I'm sure in like Europe as well. but a certain stance on like renewable energy is that like people will lose their jobs, and there isn't necessarily like a super good alternative when it comes to that. Like, how do we make up for that? In your experience, have you seen any country deal with that problem efficiently?
So, I mean, I've seen a couple of things. One is that often you end up with an increase in net jobs. I don't want to say across the board, but you lose jobs in some places, but you gain jobs in others. And certain sectors are hit really hard, like coal mining, just those jobs are gone, right? And so there are a lot of programs in Europe under kind of a term called just transition to make sure that there are employment opportunities and training opportunities for people to help transition them away from one profession to another. I know that in Germany, you know, the car industry is faced with electric cars having many fewer parts, needing less workers, and so that kind of calls for a lot of a need to address that and to address that transition. I'll also say that there are a lot of sectors where we need a lot of workers, but we don't have trained workers, and so I think that that's a big part of the picture too. A few of there's a study called Net Zero Northwest that was done by a group called the Clean Energy Transitions Institute that looks at the Pacific Northwest, and they have a job study within that you might want to take a look at. That's pretty interesting and looks at net jobs and finds net positive jobs, but it's lumpy depending on which sector you're looking at specifically, because you do end up, it is an economic transition ultimately, not just an energy transition.
So I have a question. What does France do with its nuclear waste?
I actually read up on this to prepare for that question. But I mean, so it's interesting. France, I'm not a technical person. I'm not going to use the right words. France has a problem with nuclear waste. They have not yet figured out what to do with it. They do, as I understand it, kind of use and reuse it so that there's less waste. They try to minimize the waste. At one point, this is all anecdotal, but I was reading about it, there was a plan to bury it. And that did not resonate with locals who were, particularly the term bury and permanently. And so at least this article, what ended up working was actually going out to communities and talking. And so they decided that they're storing it until they figure out what to do with it. And so that's still the case. And so the cost of actually dealing with the waste is still huge and undecided and problematic. Yeah. We do have a lot in common. Yeah.
You did a great job.
Thanks.
So I'm curious in terms of strategy for getting a transition, you know, where you're really making progress. What are the different bodies that seem to be able to, you know, create a powerful movement? Is it citizen groups? Is it legislatures? Is it, you know, elected, you know, leaders, heads of state?
Yeah.
What kind of mixture creates the movement, you know, to influence the transition?
Yeah, I think it's a combination in the end. I think that there are, and I'm interested if anybody else wants to add insights to this, because I think there might be different perspectives on it. But from what I've seen, you definitely need a kind of citizen grassroots movement, absolutely, to get buy-in and to get it right, and to also make sure that different voices are heard. It's also really important to have some kind of progressive economic actors, like people who are building the stuff that you need, right? And are willing to go out there. And so, you know, banks play a big role, those companies play a big role. And also just leadership at at all levels, at local level, at state level, at national level is really important. And by leadership, I don't mean like the boss, you know, whoever is at the top. It's not just that. It's actually just, it's amazing what, and this is more anecdotal observation, but what an individual somewhere within that hierarchy can accomplish when they're really driven and they really have a vision and have receptive, kind of receptive leadership within where they are. So it's kind of a fuzzy answer, but I think it's a little bit of everything that you need.
There are a couple questions online. The first question is, how has the change in the Polish government from the PIS to the coalition affected Poland's energy policy?
Yeah, it makes a really big difference. I mean, now Poland is talking about implementing pretty aggressive climate goals. They're still developing all of this, and I'm not following it day to day, but it makes a huge difference because now there's a vision. And I mentioned that Poland doesn't have a comprehensive climate law, but I think that's something that might be on the table. And I would say that the previous government held things back pretty strongly for a long time, and so now there's an opportunity window to get in place more climate-oriented policies.
Thank you. We'll just do one more from online and then we'll go back to the room. So the next question is, I thought the part, and this is a long one, so just buckle up. I thought the part about Germany having more diversified energy ownership to be quite interesting, so thank you for sharing. As someone who's recently graduated and is trying to remain hopeful and excited about entering the environmental health field, thank you for interrupting the doom and gloom with some clean climate hope. With the current election, the clean energy movement is a very sore topic. I want to ask what the biggest barriers to growing the clean energy sector in the States are right now, compared to other countries that seem to be moving quicker than us. Are both logistically and financially. Would you be able to talk a bit more about supply and demand in the incentivization that would need to happen? And the incentivization that would need to happen, both for consumers and political figures for the US to really start making moves towards utilizing more clean energy over fossil fuels. And we can probably pull it up on the screen if you want us to.
I wrote down biggest barriers and incentives. Does that sound right?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Supply and demand.
That's such a big question. Yeah, it's a really big question, and it doesn't have a simple answer. I think that you know, there are when you look across our country, there are states that are more committed to climate action and states that are less committed to climate action. But all states have grassroots movements pushing for climate action. And often the things that, you know, I think elected officials have a big role to play, obviously, because that's the leadership and that sets the tone. I don't think that people necessarily vote just for climate. There are a lot of other issues at play. And so I think that some of the barriers are, a lot of the barriers are political. I think there are barriers in terms of entrenched interests. There are, I'm not going to talk about all the barriers because it's just dark. Can I just say that? Also, I'm representing myself and not my employer while I'm speaking here. I just feel like I need to say that. I'd rather talk about incentives because I think that that's probably a more constructive space on kind of what the incentives are to make change. And I think that you kind of need a push and pull. You need regulations that like make things happen, but then you need something that helps incentivize change to happen too. And so that's really important. And you see that in all sorts of programs. You know, I mean, energy efficiency is a world I know a little bit better than some other sectors. And, you know, in energy efficiency, you might have a building code, but then you'll have a reach code, and then you'll have some incentives to buy the more efficient appliance or to weatherize. And so there are those kinds of incentives are really important. And I also think that it's worth, this is a different presentation, but I think that it's worth talking, just if you take a look at the numbers and at the costs of renewable electricity generation, for example, gone down hugely and now are just competing neck and neck with fossil resources. And that's something that hasn't played out yet because it's relatively recent and it's starting to play out. And so we're not necessarily seeing all of the results yet because a lot of this stuff is in the process of getting built. And so I think that, I'm going to stop there, but I think that there's a lot more that could be said. Yeah, and it looks like there's a comment from the audience that, oh, question, okay.
Thank you for your fine presentation. It was really interesting, and to see the progress, even though it's not on track for 2050, but still significant progress. I'm curious about something we deal with significantly here, even in this area, that climate skeptics.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a big issue with the transition to electric vehicles, is that there's a lot of disinformation out, clearly promulgated by manufacturers who, so anyway, there's a lot of disinformation, and there are a lot of people who just like, no, it's all, so
Mm-hmm.
really intractable resistance in some cases. And in Europe, you didn't mention any kind of, pollution, people live with pollution. There's less skepticism about, everybody has lung issues. But for these long range possibilities, here, even on the West Coast, there are many, many skeptics. In Europe, did they experience this, or was just the Green Party, was that a pivot? So anyway, what has been the experience with skepticism there?
Yeah, no, I mean, also exists. Yeah, I mean, I think in Eastern Europe in particular, I think it took longer for it's kind of where I started working, and I heard a lot of skepticism. And I think it'll always be there to some extent. And I think that the thing that needs to happen is just to demonstrate, just act. And eventually it doesn't matter what you think, because this technology is pretty cool and maybe you want it. And I will say that there are a lot of good reasons to do these things that I was talking about today that don't just have to do with climate. There's diversification of your resources. There's, energy efficiency, weatherization is just good because if there's a cold snap and the power goes out, you can maintain a healthy temperature in your home for much longer. It costs a lot less to heat your home. So there are lots of good reasons to do these things. And often I find that those are the arguments that gain more universal support and can just move us in a constructive direction without getting stuck on somebody saying, well, we don't have to do that because it's not true.
On France and nuclear energy, I thought France is doing a considerable amount of recycling of spent fuel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I understand. I'm not an expert. I mean, I read up a little bit in case I got a question on that particular topic. Yeah.
Yeah. So 92% of the energy and the fuel rods are still there.
Yeah.
They build fission products with high neutron cross sections. Everything in a reactor depends upon the neutron flux.
So Edith, thank you for a very good presentation. I'm curious whether you've looked at the sort of the geopolitics currently of natural gas in Europe. My understanding is that the final tranche of gas going through Ukraine is likely to end this year. I think the contracts end, and Ukraine, of course, is not renegotiating those contracts with the Russians. But also, I've been hearing some indications that the Europeans may be trying to open up opportunities for more American LNG as a way to placate the incoming administration. And I don't know whether they have the ability to abrogate those contracts with Libya and others or not. Do you have any sense of kind of what the current geopolitics is around LNG?
No, unfortunately, I don't have much more than what you just said. I think there are a lot of big questions. What I did read recently, but it has more to do with Russia, is that actually this year Russian imports increased, and so it's not just going to be an easy drop off. And there are some countries that are still so reliant on Russian gas. They're inland, they don't have access to an LNG port. So that's the piece that I'm more familiar with. But what's happening now on that level of, I don't know if anybody in here has more insights, but there was also a reduction in imports from the U.S. because one of our ports was down for a while, and that likely, I mean, that's another thing I read, is going to increase, but it doesn't speak to the geopolitics of the change in administration.
Anybody?
So we have probably a quite good idea living under Governor Inslee about what's going on with particularly alternative energy here. You work in Oregon. Can you draw any easy comparisons between Oregon and Washington?
Oh, gosh. Did I mention I'm relatively new to the region? I've been immersing myself in Oregon. I mean, one difference is that in Oregon, you can't site nuclear right now, and in Washington, you can. And so I've seen that there might be nuances there, but I've seen that the small modular reactors are kind of an active discussion in Washington, whereas in Oregon, at the moment they're not. It's not that they don't pop up, but right now we would need need a change in law in order to be able to build. I mean, there are a lot of similarities in terms of the hydro system, reliance on the hydro system. Washington has more consumer-owned utilities, and Oregon has more investor-owned utilities, so there's a difference in ownership structure. But in terms of energy transition, I don't know that the discussion on offshore wind has been, maybe somebody can fill this in, but I've heard less from Washington than in Oregon, where there's been a lot of attention to offshore wind. And I think in part of that's also stems from California's really ambitious offshore wind goal. Yeah, those are the things that come to mind kind of immediately. Happy for anybody else to chime in too.
Any other questions?
Thanks very much. Really useful and interesting. Couple questions. One about the impact of competition between and among countries in Europe, and we saw quite a variety of sources of energy, most of which I think you referred to what is the basic resource within the country that has driven some of those choices. But what have you seen or experienced when countries say, okay, we're gonna go faster than you? And what also has been the impact of subsidies? What we hear from the World Health Organization in the COPs is, we've got to end fossil fuel subsidies in order to make the transition, and on the basis of health.
Mm-hmm. So competition is an interesting one. I think the point that you made about one country going faster than another, I mean, when Germany's transition has been really bumpy, and so when they were shutting down nuclear power plants, they had to ramp up coal and gas essentially, and so their carbon emissions actually increased. And they also, none of these countries are an island in terms of their power system. So one of the challenges of the kind of European energy decarbonization project has been to link up the power systems. And there is protectionism that happens there. There are all sorts of geekily in deep in kind of transmission system operations and things. There are countries will hold back and not show how much transmission might be available, and that creates problems, for example. So there has been an effort to increase the kind of smooth functioning of the electricity markets in Europe, and also to bring them closer to kind of sub-hourly levels to account for fluctuations in wind and solar, which doesn't answer your question directly, but I think it's important because a really big part of succeeding with the energy transition on the electricity side is actually that trade. And so when there's in Europe, a couple of times when there's been a crisis point where some power plants are down and it's a really cold winter, the system has actually gotten into a problem because countries have become kind of protectionist about their power systems and try to just make sure they have enough for themselves. Whereas if they just would have shared, it wouldn't have gotten quite so critical. So there's a really big kind of trade issue happening. And there have been 3 directives now for the electricity sector to move towards what they call liberalization of the power sector, with really specific rules around security of supply and competition. And I didn't show imports and exports in those graphs, but there are a lot of imports and exports happening, even of gas, of coal, of other resources. On subsidies, I don't have the latest on subsidies. It's been a big discussion for a long time. I will say that, so you mean subsidies for fossil fuels, and those are a big problem, and they continue, but there's a lot of work to reduce and get rid of those subsidies. I just don't have an update for you on where Europe is compared to other places. I will say there's something interesting that's happening so electricity traditionally has had really high tax rates attached to it, higher than other fuels in Europe. Poland has an incredible, it's crazy. It's like twice as much as the power itself. Really high taxes on electricity, and that's been an issue because it disincentivizes shifting towards electric technologies like electric heat pumps. So there's been, in addition to the subsidies discussion, there's been a lot of discussion about shifting taxes that are currently just attached to power bills as a way to have stable revenues, because it creates a problem for the energy transition.
Any other questions? Do we have any questions online? Right. Thank you, Edith, very much.
Thanks, everybody.
That was great. And here's just a reminder, next month is Christmas, and so we're off, but join us in January for our second trivia night, OWAC trivia night in January. And thanks to Sherry for bringing flyers about that. There's flyers on your table. So, so thank you all for joining us this evening, and we'll see you in 2 months.